Have you ever had a dream so vivid, so unsettling, that it left a mark on your very soul? This is not just a story, this is a warning. My name is Selim Draven, and I'm a sleep researcher. My work has always been rooted in science, unraveling the mysteries of dreams and the human mind. But what I'm about to share is something science cannot explain. It began as an ordinary night, a fleeting descent into the realm of sleep. Yet, what awaited me there was no ordinary dream. It was an abyss, a place where the night itself seemed alive, and the rules of reality were left behind. The dream began in a whisper, soft and distant, like a voice calling my name. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, more insistent, dragging me into a void where shadows danced like living things. The air around me felt cold and thick, pressing against my skin with a suffocating weight. I wasn't alone, no, something was there with me. I could feel its gaze, though I couldn't see it. My heart raced as I turned, searching the impenetrable darkness, but nothing revealed itself. That was when I realized the silence wasn't natural. It was deliberate. Something was waiting, holding its breath, just beyond the edges of my perception. I stumbled forward, the ground beneath me shifting unnaturally, as though I were walking on something alive. A faint glow appeared in the distance, pulling me toward it like a moth to a flame. The light revealed a vast, desolate landscape, a forest of twisted trees whose branches clawed at the sky like skeletal hands. The moon hung low, unnaturally large, casting an eerie, sickly light that made the shadows seem to writhe and move. The whispering returned, no longer distant but right behind me, brushing against my ear with a voice that sounded almost human, but not quite. "Selim," it hissed, dragging my name into an unnatural echo. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, yet my legs refused to obey. Slowly I turned, and there it was nothing. Just the void, endless and all-encompassing, pressing against me with an unseen presence. But I knew it was there, lurking just beyond the thin veil of light. My breath came in shallow gasps, the cold seeping into my bones as fear rooted me to the spot. That's when I saw the footprints, my own, leading back into the darkness, as though I had been walking in circles. Before we go deeper into this harrowing journey, take a moment to subscribe to the Nightmare Chronicles and hit the like button. Here, we delve into the unknown, uncovering stories that challenge the boundaries of fear and reality. Remember, these aren't just stories, they're warnings. Once you step through the door to the unknown, there's no going back. Are you brave enough to keep listening? Let's find out. It began like any other dream, innocuous, fleeting, easily dismissed. But this dream was different. It pulled me in with a strange intensity, plunging me into a world that felt disturbingly real. I found myself standing at the edge of an unfamiliar forest. The trees were impossibly tall, their twisted trunks stretching into a sky painted in shades of deep indigo and black. A dense mist clung to the ground, swirling around my feet like restless spirits. There was no wind, yet the branches swayed and creaked as if whispering secrets to each other. The air carried an oppressive weight, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. But there was something else, something sharp and metallic like the scent of blood just before it dries. My skin prickled with an unshakable sense of dread, as though the forest itself was alive, watching, waiting. Somewhere in the distance, a faint sound broke the heavy silence. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming on wood. It grew louder with each passing second, echoing through the trees in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint its source. I took a hesitant step forward, the ground beneath me soft and uneven, like the forest floor was shifting under my weight. Each step seemed louder than the last, the sound of crunching leaves and snapping twigs amplified in the unnatural silence. I felt as though I were intruding, trespassing on something ancient and malevolent. My breath fogged the air as the temperature plummeted, and with it came a creeping realization. This wasn't just a dream. As I ventured deeper into the forest, the whispers began. At first, they were indistinct murmurs, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. But soon they grew louder, more insistent. Voices overlapping, speaking in a language I couldn't understand, yet their tone was unmistakable, mocking, taunting. They were talking about me. My pulse quickened and I spun around, desperate to catch sight of who, or what, was speaking. But there was nothing. Only the trees, their gnarled branches twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to reach for me. The path ahead was barely visible, illuminated by a faint, unnatural light emanating from deeper within the forest. It was a cold, sterile glow that cast long, distorted shadows. I couldn't help but follow it, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't explain. As I walked, I noticed carvings on the trees, symbols etched deep into the bark. They were intricate and strange, and as I traced my fingers over one, a jolt of icy pain shot through my hand, forcing me to pull back. The rhythmic tapping sound returned, louder and closer now, accompanied by the faintest trace of a melody. It wasn't beautiful. It was wrong, discordant, as if played on an instrument that shouldn't exist. And then through the mist I saw it. A structure loomed in the distance, barely visible through the swirling fog. It was small and decrepit, a cabin made of dark, rotting wood. Its windows were black, void-like, but a faint light flickered from within, casting eerie shadows that danced across the ground. I hesitated, every fiber of my being screaming at me to turn back. Yet something stronger compelled me forward. With each step, the forest seemed to close in, the trees forming an almost impenetrable wall behind me. There was no going back now. I reached the cabin, my trembling hand extending toward the rusted handle of the door. As my fingers brushed against it, the whispers stopped. The air grew still, the silence so absolute it was deafening. For a moment, I stood frozen, staring at the door as an overwhelming sense of wrongness washed over me. I felt like prey standing on the threshold of a predator's lair. With a deep, shuddering breath, I pushed the door open. The hinges groaned in protest, and the flickering light from inside spilled out, bathing me in its cold glow. But as I stepped inside, I realized this was no sanctuary. The cabin was empty, or so it seemed. But the air inside was heavier, charged with a suffocating energy that made it hard to breathe. A single chair sat in the center of the room, facing away from me, its back draped in shadow. My heart pounded as I stepped closer, the sound of my own footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. I reached out to touch the chair, but before my fingers could make contact, it moved. Just a fraction, but enough to send a bolt of icy terror down my spine. As I stepped further into the decrepit cabin, the atmosphere seemed to thicken, as if the air itself resisted my presence. The faint flicker of a single lantern hanging from the ceiling cast erratic, trembling shadows that twisted and danced along the warped wooden walls. The whispers I had heard outside were gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that rang in my ears like a scream, held just below the threshold of hearing. Every instinct screamed for me to leave, but I couldn't. Something held me there, an invisible tether pulling me deeper into the unknown. The room felt impossibly large, far bigger than the exterior of the cabin suggested. The walls seemed to stretch and shift, warping like liquid, creating corners where none should exist. My eyes were drawn to small details that didn't make sense. A rocking chair in the corner that swayed ever so slightly, though there was no breeze. A mirror hung crooked on the wall, its surface too dark to reflect anything but faint distortions. Each object felt deliberately placed, as though they were clues in a puzzle I was never meant to solve. I took another step, the floorboards groaning beneath me like a wounded animal. That's when I noticed the carvings. They were everywhere, etched into the wooden beams, scrawled across the floor, and even burned into the ceiling. The symbols were the same as those I had seen on the trees outside, but here they seemed alive, pulsing faintly with a dull, reddish glow. My pulse quickened as I realized they weren't just random markings. They were forming a pattern, leading my gaze to a doorway at the far end of the room. As I moved toward the doorway, an icy draft swept through the cabin, carrying with it a faint, sickly sweet smell, something like decaying flowers mixed with burnt wood. The sensation of being watched grew unbearable, and I couldn't shake the feeling that if I turned around, I would see something standing just beyond the edge of the shadows. My steps faltered, but the pull of the doorway was irresistible. Reaching the threshold, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the frame. Beyond the doorway was a staircase spiraling downward, disappearing into a darkness so complete it seemed to devour the faint light from the room behind me. The whispers returned, faint and disjointed, echoing up from the depths below. They weren't human, at least not entirely. The voices layered over one another, rising and falling in a haunting symphony that sent chills racing down my spine. I descended slowly, the stairs creaking with each step, the air growing colder with every inch I moved deeper into the abyss. The darkness pressed against me like a living thing, thick and suffocating. Halfway down, the light from above disappeared entirely, leaving me enveloped in an oppressive black void. My hand grazed the rough wall beside me, searching for balance, when I felt it, something warm and wet, like a breath exhaled against my skin. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The sensation disappeared as quickly as it came, leaving me to wonder if my mind was playing tricks on me. When I finally reached the bottom of the stairs, the whispers ceased, replaced by an eerie, pulsating hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls. I was in another room, smaller but just as warped and surreal as the one above. At its center stood a table, and on it rested an object that seemed to defy logic. A black sphere, perfectly smooth, radiating a faint, almost imperceptible glow. The light from the sphere illuminated faint outlines of figures etched into the walls, their hollow eyes and twisted forms staring back at me. As I approached the table, the hum grew louder, resonating in my chest like the tolling of a funeral bell. The closer I got, the harder it became to breathe, as if the air was being pulled out of my lungs. My trembling hand reached out to touch the sphere, compelled by a force I couldn't resist. But before I could make contact, the shadows in the room shifted violently. From the corner of my eye, I saw them, figures moving within the darkness, their forms skeletal and incomplete, yet undeniably alive. They moved closer, their hollow eyes locked onto me, their presence radiating a malevolence so intense it felt like my very soul was being drained. I stumbled backward, desperate to escape, but the staircase was gone. The walls closed in around me, the figures growing clearer with every passing moment. One of them raised a hand, pointing directly at me, and the humming stopped abruptly, plunging the room into a silence so absolute it felt deafening. As the silence enveloped me, the air became heavier, pressing against my chest like an invisible weight. My pulse thundered in my ears, but even that seemed muted, as though the room itself was devouring every sound. The figures in the shadows were no longer just silhouettes. They were becoming more defined, their forms grotesque and twisted, as if they were incomplete versions of something that once resembled human. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly, a sickly yellow that pulsed in unison with the black sphere on the table. I felt an unnatural compulsion to look away, to avoid their gaze, but I couldn't. Something held my attention, as if their very presence demanded to be seen. One figure stepped forward, its skeletal frame impossibly tall, its movements slow and deliberate. As it moved, its limbs cracked and bent unnaturally, like a marionette controlled by unseen strings. It stopped mere feet from me, its empty gaze fixed on mine. Despite its silence, I could feel its intention, an overwhelming sense of dread that pierced me to my core. Suddenly, the black sphere on the table began to glow brighter, its surface swirling with faint patterns that looked like shifting constellations. A low, guttural sound filled the room, vibrating through the walls and into my bones. It was coming from the sphere. The sound wasn't random. It was a voice layered and distorted, speaking words in a language I couldn't understand. Yet, somehow, I knew it was speaking to me. My body moved on its own, as though I were a puppet being guided by the same unseen force controlling the figures. I reached out, my hand trembling as it hovered above the sphere. The glow intensified, illuminating the room in bursts of cold, white light. The walls seemed to writhe and shift, revealing glimpses of something beyond, an endless void filled with more of the skeletal figures, their hollow eyes all trained on me. Just as my fingers brushed the surface of the sphere, the figure before me lunged. Its skeletal hand gripped my wrist, its touch searingly cold, yet it burned like fire. I tried to pull away, but its grip was unyielding. The moment its touch connected with mine, my mind was flooded with visions, flashes of a world consumed by darkness, where time itself seemed frozen, and countless figures like the one before me roamed endlessly through desolate landscapes. The voice from the sphere grew louder, its words finally becoming clear. "You were chosen," it said, its tone both commanding and filled with an ancient sorrow. "The cycle must continue." The figure released my wrist, and I stumbled backward, gasping for breath. But before I could react further, the sphere shattered, sending shards of darkness spiraling into the room. The shards pierced the figures, one by one, dissolving them into ash that swirled violently before being sucked into the void beyond the walls. The room itself began to collapse, the floorboards splitting and crumbling into the blackness below. I fell to my knees, the oppressive weight of the atmosphere pinning me down. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was the symbol, etched into the table where the sphere once sat. It pulsed once, twice, then vanished. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my bed, drenched in sweat and gasping for air. The light of dawn filtered through my curtains, but it brought no comfort. My wrists still burned where the figure had touched me, and as I sat up, I noticed something etched into the skin, a faint outline of the symbol from the table. I wanted to believe it was just a lingering memory from the dream, but deep down I knew better. What would you do if a nightmare left a mark that followed you into the waking world? Have you ever experienced something so vivid, so terrifying, that it stayed with you long after you woke up? Let me know in the comments below. And if this story has left you breathless, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Nightmare Chronicles. The journey doesn't end here. This is only the beginning. Are you ready to face what's next? When I woke up, I told myself it was just a nightmare, a vivid, terrifying nightmare. But that lie crumbled the moment I looked down at my wrist. The faint symbol etched into my skin wasn't just a trick of the mind or a fading dream. It was real as the cold sweat on my body and the ache in my chest from the fear that gripped me in the dream. The symbol pulsed faintly, almost as if it were alive, a brand marking me as part of something I didn't understand. Desperate for answers, I spent the next day consumed by research. I scoured the internet for any mention of symbols like the one on my wrist. Hours passed as I sifted through obscure forums, forgotten books digitized into archives, and cryptic, half-finished blog posts written by people who seemed to know more than they should. Then I found it. A single photograph buried in an article about ancient rituals. It was the same symbol, carved into the stone of a forgotten ruin deep within a forest known for disappearances. The article mentioned local legends tied to the ruin, tales of travelers who ventured too far into the forest only to return changed, or not return at all. Whispers of the endless night followed these stories, describing dreams that became all too real and left marks on their victims, just like the one I bore. My stomach churned as I read accounts of people hearing voices, seeing shadows that didn't belong, and being haunted by a presence they couldn't escape. I reached out to the author of the article, an old folklorist named Victor, who had dedicated his life to studying such phenomena. His reply came quicker than expected, though it was far from reassuring. "If you've seen the symbol," his email began, "then you've been marked. You're part of it now, whether you like it or not." He refused to elaborate further over email, but agreed to meet me in person, insisting that the answers I sought couldn't be trusted to digital communication. Before the meeting, I noticed things around me beginning to change. At first, they were small. Objects in my apartment seemed slightly out of place, though I couldn't recall moving them. The shadows in the corners of the room grew darker, lingering even in direct sunlight. The sense of being watched became unbearable, as though unseen eyes followed my every move. Then the whispers returned. They started faintly, barely audible, like a low hum at the edge of my hearing. But as night fell, they grew louder, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. They weren't just in my head. I could feel the vibrations of their words in the walls, the floor, even in the air I breathed. I tried to drown them out with music, but nothing worked. They were always there, waiting for the silence to return, so they could creep back into my consciousness. When I met Victor, he looked worse than I imagined, gaunt, his face pale and hollow, as though the knowledge he carried had drained him of life. He wasted no time, pushing a folder across the table filled with faded photographs and yellowed documents. Among them were sketches of the symbol, detailed maps of the forest, and journal entries written in frantic, erratic handwriting. "The endless night isn't just a dream," Victor said, his voice low and filled with urgency. "It's a gateway. The symbol marks those who are chosen, those who are meant to open the door. But once the door is open, it can't be closed. Not without a cost." I asked him why me, why now, but he shook his head. "There's no pattern, no logic. It chooses who it chooses. The question isn't why. The question is what you're willing to do to stop it." He pointed to one of the documents, a first-hand account from a man who had disappeared decades ago. His final words, scrawled in red ink, read, "The night is eternal, but it can be undone, if you dare to face the truth." I felt a chill run down my spine as Victor leaned closer, his eyes searching mine. "The dreams will keep coming," he whispered, "and the shadows will get closer. You can try to run, but it won't matter. The only way to end this is to go back, to the forest, to the ruins. The answers are waiting, but so is the darkness." As I left the meeting, clutching the folder tightly, I felt the weight of his words settle over me like a shroud. The whispers had grown louder, their voices now clear and unmistakable. They weren't just calling me back, they were warning me. The decision to go to the forest wasn't easy. Every fiber of my being told me to ignore Victor's warnings, to try to return to normal life, but the whispers wouldn't allow it. They grew louder with each passing night, their voices blending into an unholy chorus. My dreams had become vivid nightmares, dragging me back into that endless twilight where the shadows seemed closer, more alive. The symbol on my wrist pulsed faintly, its glow growing stronger, as if urging me toward some dark destiny. The journey to the forest was uneventful, but the moment I arrived at its edge, an unnatural stillness fell over the area. The trees loomed like ancient sentinels, their twisted branches forming an impenetrable canopy that blocked out the sky. The air was thick, heavy with moisture and the faint stench of decay. It was as if the forest itself exhaled dread, warning me to turn back. But something deeper, primal, pushed me forward. Every step into the forest felt wrong. The ground beneath me was soft, almost spongy, as though it were absorbing my presence. Shadows clung to the trees, twisting and shifting even when there was no light to cast them. I heard faint sounds, leaves rustling, branches cracking, but they never seemed to come from where I expected. It was as though the forest itself was alive, watching, waiting for the right moment to act. I followed the map Victor had given me, tracing the path to the ruins marked in red ink. It was a winding, disorienting route that seemed designed to make me lose my way. The deeper I ventured, the more surreal the surroundings became. The trees no longer resembled trees but grotesque shapes, their trunks warped and faces seemingly carved into the bark, their hollow eyes staring back at me. My flashlight flickered erratically, the beam struggling to pierce the growing darkness. As I pressed on, I stumbled upon a clearing, its center dominated by a strange stone altar. It was cracked and worn, its surface covered in the same symbols etched into my wrist. Surrounding it were remnants of old rituals, burnt candles, decayed offerings, and bones, both animal and human. My stomach churned at the sight, but before I could retreat, a voice cut through the silence. "Why have you come?" I spun around, my flashlight trembling in my hand. A man stood at the edge of the clearing, his face pale and drawn, his clothes tattered and soaked as if he had just crawled from a swamp. His eyes were wide and unblinking, filled with a hollow terror that sent chills racing down my spine. "I was marked," I said, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "I need answers." The man stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator circling prey. "There are no answers," he said. "Only choices, and none of them will save you." Before I could respond, the ground beneath us trembled, a low rumble emanating from deep within the earth. The altar began to glow, its cracks seeping a faint, reddish light. The air grew colder, and the whispers returned, louder now, almost deafening. The man grabbed my arm, his grip like ice. "They're here," he whispered, his voice trembling. "The shadows. They've been waiting for you." Suddenly, the darkness around us moved. It wasn't natural, it wasn't the absence of light. It was alive, writhing and shifting like a mass of liquid shadow. Figures began to emerge from it, their forms indistinct yet horrifying. They had no faces, only smooth, featureless voids where eyes and mouths should have been. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, as though they were being pulled by invisible strings. The man released me and backed away. "You can't fight them," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You can only decide, run, or face the truth." The figures moved closer, their presence overwhelming. The whispers were no longer incoherent. They spoke in a single, unified voice, calling my name, demanding something I didn't understand. I felt paralyzed, my mind screaming at me to move, but my body refused to obey. The symbol on my wrist burned fiercely, its glow now matching the pulsating light of the altar. And then, as if guided by an unseen force, I stepped toward the altar. The figures stopped, their hollow faces tilting as though observing my every move. I reached out, my hand trembling, and placed it on the cold stone. The moment I made contact, the whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that seemed to stretch on forever. A vision filled my mind, a memory that wasn't mine. I saw the forest as it once was, vibrant and alive, before it was consumed by darkness. I saw the ruins being built, a desperate attempt to contain something that should never have been unleashed. And then I saw myself, standing in the clearing, the figures surrounding me. The vision faded, and I was back in the clearing, the figures now mere feet away. The man was gone, vanished as if he had never been there. The altar pulsed one last time, and the shadows began to close in. I knew then that my journey wasn't over, it was only beginning. The air around me thickened as the shadows closed in, their presence tangible, suffocating. The figures moved closer, their faceless heads tilting unnaturally, as though they were studying me. The whispers returned, but now they spoke directly to my mind, 1,000 voices overlapping, all saying the same thing: choose. My heart pounded, my body trembling as I stood frozen before the altar, the symbol on my wrist glowing brighter with each passing second. The altar pulsed beneath my hand, the stone unnaturally warm, as if alive. A crack formed along its surface, spilling a blinding light that bathed the clearing in a ghostly glow. The The shadows recoiled slightly, but did not retreat. From within the crack emerged a small object, a fragment of blackened stone, smooth and cold. I didn't know why, but I knew it was significant. As I hesitated, the voices grew louder, demanding an answer to a question I didn't understand. The forest seemed to twist and warp around me, the trees stretching impossibly high, their branches forming grotesque shapes that loomed over the clearing. My vision blurred, and in that disorienting haze, I saw them, the faces of the figures. They weren't blank anymore. They were human, their features distorted by pain and fear. I recognized them from the journals and stories I had read, the lost travelers, the missing villagers, the people who had disappeared into the forest over centuries. They were trapped, their souls bound to this endless night, waiting for something or someone to set them free. The whispers shifted, no longer chaotic but eerily coherent. They spoke of the endless night, of how it wasn't merely a place or a dream, but a prison for an ancient entity. The figures were its wardens, the shadows its chains, and the symbol on my wrist was a key. I was the chosen one, the one meant to decide its fate. I felt a sudden presence behind me, cold and overwhelming. Turning slowly, I came face to face with the shadow, the same figure that had haunted my dreams. Its form was larger now, towering over me, its eyes hollow voids that seemed to draw in all light. It raised an arm, pointing to the fragment in my hand, and then to the altar. The choice was clear: place the fragment back into the altar and strengthen the prison, keeping the entity bound for eternity, or take the fragment and walk away, freeing it. But at what cost? I hesitated, my mind racing. If I left, I would be free from this nightmare, but I would unleash something that had been locked away for a reason. If I stayed and returned the fragment, I might trap myself here forever, joining the ranks of the lost. The whispers grew frantic, pleading with me in their dissonant voices. The shadow remained still, its gaze unyielding, waiting for my decision. As I stood there, a memory flashed through my mind, a fragment of the vision I had seen earlier. It showed the forest, vibrant and alive, before the darkness consumed it. In that moment, I realized that the endless night wasn't just a prison, it was a cycle. The entity fed on fear, on despair, and each time it was freed, it brought destruction, only to be sealed away again. The figures around me weren't wardens. They were its victims, people who had made the wrong choice. With trembling hands, I lifted the fragment and held it over the altar. The shadow moved closer, its presence overwhelming, and for a moment, I thought it might stop me. But it didn't. Instead, it leaned in, its hollow face inches from mine, and spoke in a voice that was both a whisper and a roar. "You cannot stop what has already begun." Summoning every ounce of courage, I slammed the fragment into the crack in the altar. The light exploded outward, engulfing the clearing in a blinding brilliance. The shadows screamed, their forms dissolving into wisps of smoke, and the figures let out cries of relief before vanishing into the light. The forest itself seemed to groan, the ground shaking violently as the altar sealed itself, the crack disappearing as though it had never been there. When the light faded, the forest was silent. The shadows were gone, and the symbol on my wrist had dimmed, leaving only a faint scar. I stumbled backward, exhausted and disoriented. The man who had warned me earlier appeared once more, his expression a mix of relief and sorrow. "You've delayed it," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "But it's never truly over. The cycle will begin again, and when it does, someone else will be chosen. Pray they make the right choice." The clearing began to fade, the trees dissolving into darkness. I felt myself being pulled away, my body weightless, as if I were falling. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my room, lying on the floor. The morning sun streamed through the window, but it brought no comfort. The whispers were gone, but the scar on my wrist was a constant reminder of what I had faced, and what might still come. The symbol appeared in unexpected places, on pages of books I had never read, etched into the frost on my window, and even in my dreams. The endless night wasn't finished with me. I thought it was over when I woke up in my room, the sunlight streaming through my window like a promise of normalcy. For a brief moment, I believed that the nightmare was behind me. The air was still, the whispers gone, and my body felt heavier, as if it had finally been released from an invisible grip. But as the hours stretched on, the weight of what had happened refused to lift. Something wasn't right. The scar on my wrist, where the glowing symbol once burned, felt cold to the touch, like ice buried beneath my skin. I caught myself staring at it, tracing its faint outline over and over. It was no longer glowing, but it seemed to shift subtly, its edges almost imperceptibly moving, as though it were alive. At first, I told myself it was my imagination, but then the marks started appearing elsewhere. It began with small things. The same symbol etched into the condensation on my bathroom mirror. A faint outline of it drawn into the dust on my bookshelf. I wiped it away every time, but it always returned, as if mocking my attempts to move on. Then came the dreams, fragmented flashes of the forest, the altar, and the figures. They were no longer clear visions but distorted memories, disjointed and wrong. In these dreams, I wasn't just standing at the altar. I was part of it, my body consumed by the glowing light as the shadows encircled me. One night, as I was reviewing Victor's folder of notes, I found something I hadn't noticed before. Scrawled in the margins of one of the documents was a single line, written hastily in faded ink. "The door is never truly closed." My heart sank. The words resonated deeply, as if they had been left there for me specifically, a grim reminder that my actions in the clearing weren't the end of the story. The next day, I received an email from an unknown sender. The subject line read, "Do you feel it watching?" The message contained no text, just an image, a photograph of the altar. But this time, the crack in the stone was gone, replaced by a faint outline of the symbol, pulsing with that same eerie light. I deleted the email immediately, but the damage was done. That night, the whispers returned. They weren't loud like before, but soft, almost gentle, as if trying to lure me into complacency. They spoke my name, repeating it over and over, interspersed with fragments of sentences I couldn't fully understand. "You delayed it, but not forever. It's waiting." The presence I had felt in the forest began creeping into my waking life. Shadows in my apartment moved when there was no light to cast them. Objects shifted positions without explanation. And always the symbol appeared, on walls, on windows, even etched faintly into the fabric of my clothes. The worst came 2 nights ago. I woke up suddenly, my heart racing, and saw it, the shadow. It stood at the foot of my bed, tall and imposing, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. All I could do was stare as it leaned closer, its face mere inches from mine. Then, in that voice I'll never forget, it whispered, "The cycle has begun again." I woke up in the morning, drenched in sweat, my body trembling. I told myself it was just another dream, but the scar on my wrist burned as if freshly branded. That's when I noticed it, a faint outline of the symbol, now carved into my headboard, perfectly matching the mark on my skin. Since that night, I felt a constant presence, a weight pressing down on me no matter where I go. It's as though the shadow followed me back, lingering just out of sight but never truly gone. And the whispers, they've become clearer. They no longer plead or taunt, they instruct. They tell me to return to the forest, to open the door I tried to seal. They say the entity hasn't forgotten me, that it never will. I've tried to ignore them, to convince myself that it's all in my head. But deep down, I know the truth. The endless night isn't just a dream, or a place, or a prison. It's alive, and it's waiting for me to make my move. What would you do if you realized the nightmare wasn't over? That it had followed you back, lingering in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike? Could you face it, or would you run? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if this story has gripped your soul, hit the like button and share it with others. Don't forget to subscribe to Nightmare Chronicles, because this is just the beginning. The endless night isn't finished, and neither am I. Until next time, if you dare to return.